Good afternoon. Can you hear me in the back?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Barbara, for a wonderful introduction. I will talk about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, how we started it, what motivated it, some of the successes, some of the challenges, and perhaps at the end, before the discussion, I may open some questions to you in this community, what you can do, if you're convinced, what you can do to help us. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions started with a call, a BDS call, that came out in 2005, as many of you know, from the great majority of Palestinian society, which included all political parties, all trade unions, women's groups, NGO networks, refugee networks, and so on. So it was the largest coalition in Palestinian society ever, actually in decades, to come together and agree on a common denominator, on three basic rights anchored in international law, without which the Palestinians cannot exercise our inalienable right to self-determination, ending the occupation, ending the system of racial discrimination, and allowing the refugees to return and be compensated for pillaged property. Why do we focus on the three rights, rather than just ending the occupation, as sometimes we hear in this country? Why can't you just focus on ending the occupation? Because we understand it much more. Well, sorry to inconvenience you, but our rights are not negotiated away just because they're not very convenient or they're not very understood. We have to spend more time to explain them, but we don't do away with them just because they might not be very popular. The Palestinian people are not just those in the occupied territories of 1967, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. In fact, only 38% of the Palestinians are in the occupied territories of 1967. 12% are Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel who carry Israeli citizenship, and a whole 50% of the Palestinian people are in exile. So a majority of our people, half at least, lives in exile outside of historic Palestine, today's State of Israel, West Bank, and Gaza, not allowed to go home simply because they're the wrong type, the wrong identity. They're not Jewish. So it's important to focus on the three basic rights of the three main components of the Palestinian people, without which we cannot have self-determination. So it's not just about ending the occupation, it's also ending the system of inequality, racial discrimination within Israel, which meets the UN definition of apartheid, and allowing the refugees to return. To achieve those three goals, we've called for a boycott, divestment, and sanctions in all fields: economic, financial, cultural, academic, military, and so on, against Israel, against Israeli institutions that are complicit in Israel's violations of human rights, and against international institutions as well. Many of the BDS campaigns in this country are targeting American companies, or French companies, or British companies, not necessarily just Israeli companies, because many of these corporations and multinationals maintain Israel's regime of oppression against us by the services and the products they provide to the Israeli state. So it's important to target them as well. A very important component of the BDS movement, small but very important, which is never discussed in the mainstream media in this country, is our Israeli partners. We do have Israeli partners in the BDS movement: Boycott from Within, Who Profits, which are a project started by Israeli women that documents the company's complicity in the occupation. As I said, it's a small group, but they're very influential. And the main evidence of that is that in July 2011, Israel passed an anti-boycott law that makes it pretty much illegal, almost criminal, to advocate for a boycott of anything Israeli, any product, any institution, anything. And the most nuanced boycott call would be treated as illegal, and you would have to pay a fine, a tort actually, it's not a crime for those of you who are lawyers. So you would have to pay a fine, which is several $1,000s. So just to suppress Israeli support for the boycott, because it targets only Israelis, this law. If those of our Israeli partners are so ineffective, why would Israel bother to pass such a draconian, repressive, anti-freedom of speech law that makes it drop its last mask of democracy? Clearly, it feels the impact of those. So it's important to mention that. Globally, BDS, although started in 2005, took off in the last few years, particularly after the massacre in Gaza, 2008, 2009, which Barbara referred to, and the Freedom Flotilla bloodbath in 2010. Those two events played a very key role in raising awareness among international communities much faster than before. Many people who were sitting on the fence until then just jumped to the right side of history after those events and said, we cannot sit on the fence, we've got to do something about it. But we often hear, why should Americans even get involved? I mean, you know why, but we have to explain it to the wider public. We have enough problems of our own in this country, many people would say. I mean, just drive around, walk around. It's horrendous. I mean, what's happening? I lived in New York for 11 years, and I left the US in 1993. And when I compare what the US looked like in 93 and what it looks like now, it has deteriorated quite a lot. Public services, health services, education. I mean, I never heard of public schools being shut down when I lived in the US for 11 years. Now they are being shut down because of lack of funding. Well, guess why? Because all the money is going to the military. When the Pentagon's budget is $700 billion plus, of course the roads will be crumbling and the hospitals and the schools. That's where the money's going. And that's where Israel fits very well. It fits in that militarized agenda very, very well and very deeply, much more than many people would recognize, in fact. From training police forces in this country, militarizing them, testing American weapons on Palestinian innocent civilians. Many of the weapons used against us are American weapons, and they're tested against us, the guinea pigs, and sold to the world as field-tested weapons, because the Pentagon doesn't have any other place to test those weapons. So it gives them to Israel, and it tests them for the US. And it's much, much deeper than that. Israel is an excellent asset if you're in the death business. If you produce weapons and if you homeland security and all that, Israel is excellent for business because it wages wars as a matter of habit. Every couple of years, Israel wages a war and uses tons of weaponry from the United States, making this industry work very well. So most of the billions and billions of dollars that the US gives to Israel come back to the military establishment in this country. And let's not miss that link. So Israel has a hold on Congress, has enormous influence in Congress, not just because the Zionist Jewish lobby or Zionist Christian fundamentalist lobbies are doing a tremendous job. They are. They are, certainly. They're very well organized. They know how to bully, how to intimidate. And as Thomas Friedman said, Congress is bought and paid for by the Israel lobby. But that's only one side of the story. The other side of the story is this military establishment, the largest lobby of all, that maintains the Israel connection very, very deeply. So it's important to unpack this relationship, to understand why there's no light of day between the US and Israel, as Obama and Kerry and everyone else is obliged to say, to maintain their office. It's part of that. So the BDS movement called for a boycott in all these fields, and we understand that this is not the only injustice in the world, not necessarily the worst injustice in the world. It's important to connect it to other struggles, social, economic justice struggles, environmental justice struggles, anti-poverty, struggles for freedom around the world, for equal rights, gender equality, and so on, LGBT rights. It's important to connect the struggles and to see the Palestinian struggle as one of this international community struggling against oppression everywhere. But as international law expert and academic and former ICC judge, Professor John Dugard, South African John Dugard, said, today Palestine is the litmus test of the validity of international law. The rest of the world is watching. If international law continues to fail the Palestinians, it will mean absolutely nothing to the majority of the peoples around the world. So it's a very important litmus test. So Palestine gains much more importance in that respect than just this little people, relatively speaking, being oppressed by the State of Israel. To achieve our goals of ending the occupation of 1967, ending the system of racial discrimination, and allowing the refugees to return, we've launched campaigns around the world for academic, cultural, economic boycott, and so on. I'll share with you some of the examples of success that we've had. I'll start with the academic, because Barbara mentioned that. In 2013, which will be remembered as a year of many precedents in the United States for the BDS movement, 4 academic associations passed the academic boycott of Israeli institutions. Besides the American Studies Association, Association for Asian American Studies, Native American and Indigenous Studies, as well as the Association for Humanist Sociology. So 4 associations passed the academic boycott, which 2 years ago would have sounded dreamy, like a pipe dream, impossible to consider that any American academic association will pass a academic boycott resolution. And of course, it's important to explain that the academic boycott that the Palestinian campaign has called for is an institutional boycott. It does not target individual academics, it targets the institutions because of their deep, decades-old complicity in designing, in implementing, and in justifying Israel's regime of oppression against the Palestinian people. Very deeply involved in this process, Israeli academia. So some of the successes we've had besides the United States associations passing academic boycott, the Teachers Union of Ireland unanimously last year passed the academic boycott of Israel. The Federation of Francophone Belgian Students, which represents 100,000 Belgian students, passed the academic boycott of Israel. December 2012, the ANC, the African National Congress, the ruling party of South Africa, voted to endorse BDS, which is extremely important for us. Stephen Hawking last year boycotted a conference, a high-profile conference in Israel, led by Shimon Peres, the president of Israel, after receiving many appeals from Palestinian academics, American, British academics, and others. So there's been a proliferation of successes in the academic and cultural sphere as well. It's not just Roger Waters, Pink Floyd, who has not just endorsed the cultural boycott of Israel, but called on all fellow musicians to boycott Israel as, quote, we did to South Africa, he said. This comparison with what was done against South Africa is coming again and again in the mainstream media today. Today it's in The Guardian, even the New York Times and Haaretz. It's increasingly coming up that the world did isolate South African apartheid. Why is it having such a difficult time conceiving of isolating the Israeli regime of oppression against the Palestinians to compel Israel to comply with its obligations under international law? So, does that mean that we're pushing for a particular solution in the BDS movement? Absolutely not. Each one of us activists has his or her own opinion about what the political outcome should be. But in the BDS movement, in the BNC, the BDS National Committee, as the largest coalition in Palestinian society, we're absolutely neutral on the question of what the political outcome should be. We say, regardless what the outcome should be, our 3 basic rights should be respected. Ending the occupation, ending apartheid, and the right of return. Those have to be respected. 2-state, 5-state, 1-state, we don't care. Those 3 rights must be respected. So besides the academic and cultural, many people ask, but does this have any impact on the Israeli economy? Because Israel remains not just a very powerful military with hundreds of nuclear weapons, but a very strong economy as well. Mainly thanks to your tax money, subsidies in many, many different ways that Israel receives from the United States, open markets it receives in Europe and the United States for its products, and many other factors, internal Israeli factors, where Israel has distinguished itself in certain niche markets. Regardless, the Israeli economy is strong. So unless we impact that, we cannot claim to be succeeding with this movement. The cultural academic boycott is fine, but how does it impact the economic boycott? Well, Israel is a very special case where the academia, as I said, plays a key role in whitewashing, in presenting the brand Israel as something enlightened, white, Beethoven, nanotechnology, agricultural technology, and so on. That's how Israel is presented in the mainstream media and in academic conferences, where Israeli academia plays a very important role in projecting this very false, fabricated image of Israeli society, hiding, covering up the occupation, the apartheid regime, the oppression of the Palestinians, the ethnic cleansing, the wall, and so on. So this branding that Israel has been doing for decades, but extremely extensively since 2005, since the BDS movement was established, was met with our own exposure of the brand Israel. So when Alice Walker, the famous African-American writer, refuses to have her book published by an Israeli publisher until, as she says, Israeli apartheid ends, this sends a very strong message to all her millions of readers. Not just African-Americans, her readers worldwide. They get the message from Alice Walker because we cannot reach them. When Roger Waters calls for a boycott, his millions of fans around the world start learning a lot about what's happening to the Palestinians through Roger Waters. So the brand gets undermined. This brand that Israel has spent billions to build over the years is being undermined. And this is exactly the process that happened in South Africa. We're very closely connected with leaders of the African National Congress that led the anti-apartheid movement. And they tell us how it all started. Those small boycotts of South African potatoes, South African wine, South African oranges were really tiny campaigns at first. But they helped raise a lot of awareness to the extent, after many, many years, the brand South Africa became a negative brand. If you saw product of South Africa, you started associating it with all kinds of racism and nasty apartheid, and you're just untouchable. You don't want to touch those oranges because they had South Africa on them. We're not there yet, but we're getting there. Today, maybe in Britain, in Scandinavia, in Spain, in Italy, if an average consumer passes by and sees cherry tomatoes, product of Israel, I'm not touching them. Because Israel, in their minds, became associated with occupation, with oppression, violations of international law. What's the evidence of that? Are we just trying to, pat ourselves on the shoulders and congratulate ourselves? Actually, if we look at polls of public opinion, in particular the BBC poll GlobeScan, which is an annual poll of international public opinion of ranking countries according to how negatively they are perceived. Over the last few years, Israel has consistently been competing with North Korea over the third or fourth worst perceived country on earth. And this is not just in the opinions of Brazilians and South Africans and Indians, our natural allies, the Spaniards, the French, the British, the Germans, the Italians, and so on and so forth. Two-thirds majorities across Europe view Israel negatively. So that all the propaganda and the branding are not working for Israel because it commits a crime and it wipes out all its gains from those propaganda systems that it uses.